Good afternoon and welcome to the Seattle Public Library. My name is Billy. I'm a librarian in the History, Travel, and Maps unit here at the Central Library. I'd like to thank you all for attending today's program. We're very excited to have with us local storyteller Rosette Royale and 3 guests discuss the LGBTQ+ history of Pioneer Square. I also created a map that you can take with you on the related walking tour by Rosette and HistoryLink. That's up here. I would first like to acknowledge that we are on the unceded ancestral land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, and we honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. I encourage all of us to learn more about the Duwamish people, past and present, by visiting duwamishtribe.org and realrentduwamish.org, and to read books by Indigenous Coast Salish authors and writers. Talk to any library staff for specific suggestions. I would also like to take a moment to offer my thanks to the generations of LGBTQ+ siblings that came before us. Some of you are here in this room with us right now, and many more we lost to violence and from the HIV/AIDS crisis, worsened by a willfully negligent public health response. We still feel the loss today and always, but we are also here because of bravery and love. Yours and their advocacy is why I can be up here today addressing you. We will still have more work to do, but the foundation that was built was strong, and the queer and trans employees at Seattle Public Library are engaging in the work daily. I have a couple of quick announcements before we begin. The Seattle channel is recording this event to air later on their public access channel. We also have live captioning available by using your personal device to scan a code or go to the URL, and those are both on the table as you come in. If you don't have a device and would like to access live captioning, we also have some you can borrow. Just let me know when I'm done introducing. We also have our virtual sign language interpreters with us here on screen today. And we encourage you to fill out the survey located at the entrance, grab some stickers, pins, and other goodies, and browse some of the books we brought related to the program. If you need to exit early for any reason, please use the black door to your right. This door is also the exit for the restrooms and is the emergency exit. I'd like to give special thanks to my colleague Emily for coordinating this event, and to our friends at HistoryLink.org, the free online encyclopedia of Washington State history. In addition to providing articles, biographies, and timelines related to local history, HistoryLink partnered with experts to create walking tours of different neighborhoods in Seattle, including the LGBTQ+ Pioneer Square tour we'll be discussing today. Today we have with us Rosette Royale, pronouns he, she, and they, a writer and storyteller. Joining Rosette, we have Julian Barr, a historical geographer, Gil Gordon, and Todd Radovich. Oh, Tony, I'm so sorry. Tony Radovich. I skipped over some lines there. My apologies. Both of whom spent time in Pioneer Square. We are so thrilled to have you all here today. Take it away, Rosette.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. It's lovely to see you all here today on this sort of drizzly, gray June day, right? We got sort of tricked, right? Earlier, like in April when it was like 80 degrees and everyone was like, summer! But not yet. But it's lovely to have you all here to warm up this space and have a good time with each other. So yes, my name is Rosette Royale. I'm a writer and storyteller here in Seattle. And I am so excited to be here. And we're here to tell stories about the LGBTQ+ history of Pioneer Square. So I thought I'd begin with my own story. So I moved to Seattle in 2003. And the first place I lived was Capitol Hill. Yeah. My address was 1728 and a half Summit Avenue. Yeah, I lived in a half, honey. I loved living in a half. That was great. So 1728 and a half Summit, and it was a rough block. I can't lie. It was a really rough block. But I lived in this great big old unheated Victorian house. There were squirrels living in the walls, but I paid $200 a month to stay in the attic. So, you know, I handled it just fine. And the great thing about that location was that there were so many queer landmarks nearby. A block to the west, there was the Crescent Lounge for me. 2 blocks to the south, there was Steamworks, Bathhouse. And then around the corner and at the end of the block, that was Beyond the Closet bookstore. Remember that, Beyond the Closet? I mean, gosh. So all those places were there. And, you know, there I was, this queer, middle-aged person living in this place. And when people talked about Capitol Hill, they were like, oh, Capitol Hill, it's the heart of the LGBTQ Seattle. And, you know, I was like, oh, yeah, it is. But then I began to hear stories about Seattle, and I started to realize that there's more than just one Seattle, that there are many Seattles, and they're kind of stacked on top of each other. And sometimes it's hard to see the Seattle that's underneath the Seattle that you're in right there. And so through that, I began to learn about the LGBTQ plus history of Pioneer Square. And it's just fascinated me, right? And it just sort of energized me. And so what I hope to do today is share some of that fascination and some of that energy with you. But before we begin, I want to say a few things. First, this isn't a complete story, all right? That's because many of the people who have experienced parts of this story are no longer here. And some of the people who are still here might not be in this space with us right now. So that means that some of the people I hoped could be here aren't able to join us. And particularly, I was really wanting to hear and have present voices of people who identify as lesbian or trans in this space. So even though they may not necessarily be standing up here today or seated in one of these chairs, I want to say that their stories are a part of the LGBTQ plus history of Pioneer Square, all right? And even though, you know, you see my name up there, luckily it has guests. I say luckily for me, because I don't know this whole story, right? But my guests know part of this story. They have lived experience of this story. And so this story is so big, it's not really about me, it's really about us. So I want this whole experience to be about us, and I just happen to be the person who's standing at the microphone telling you a little bit about it. Okay? So I came to this story through a job, really. You know, even though I had heard about the LGBTQ plus history of Pioneer Square, it was really when I was approached by HistoryLink.org to write a walking tour of the history of Pioneer Square that I really began to learn more about the area and its history. So you can read this walking tour. I guess I should say, first of all, it's like a written text. So I wrote a written text first, and you can read this walking tour by visiting HistoryLink.org and clicking on the tab that says Tours. Then that written tour served as the basis for a 3-part podcast about the area called Square One. And you can find that podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And if you want to see me like traipsing around Pioneer Square, right, in a really fabulous silver shirt, you can find a video podcast on the HistoryLink Vimeo page. And so some of what you're going to hear today and some of what you'll see comes from that text and that video and some audio as well. So after learning so much about this neighborhood, I often call Pioneer Square Seattle's original Faberhood. And you know, it makes sense that this area was sort of the original of something because many things began in Pioneer Square. In 1852, it became the area's first long-term settlement of non-indigenous folks, which sadly displaced the Duwamish and Squamish from their ancestral homeland. The waterfront played home to the region's first steam-powered lumber mill, built by Henry Yesler, And in 1914, Smith Tower became the city's first skyscraper. So for many years, Pioneer Square was the center of novelty. But as the city grew, Pioneer Square kind of lost its luster, and people who were often marginalized kind of migrated to the area to find opportunity. And so today, some of those people who went there might have identified as LGBTQ+. And as early as the 1930s, they visited an after-hours club called the Casino. So the Casino was located in a basement at 2nd Avenue South and South Washington Street, and it began as a daytime card room and pool hall frequented by Filipino customers. In the evening, the card and pool tables were kind of pushed to the walls to transform the space into this after-hours club. And LGBTQ plus folks lined up at the doors with beer and brown paper bags. And so this underground space helped to anchor Pioneer Square as a center of LGBTQ plus community, a role that only grew as the neighborhood took on a new identity. At some point, the Casino allowed same-sex dancing. Now, when this happened isn't clear, but it changed from being a social club to a dance hall. And with that change, there was sort of a change in how people referred to it, sort of the name. And so in the 1950s, people started calling the Casino Madam Peabody's Dancing Academy for Young Ladies. Sometimes they called it Madam Peabody's School of Dance for Young Ladies. But basically, there was the Madam Peabody's, and sometimes people just cut to the chase and they called it the dance. So, here it is again. Same place, new name, new identity. So one thing that is great about a place called Madam Peabody's is that when people went there, they remembered it. And the people who went brought their own attitudes and ideas about gender and sexuality. So we can get a peek into some of these attitudes through oral history. And in the mid-1990s, a group called the Northwest Lesbian and Gay History Museum Project conducted oral histories of LGBTQ plus folks. These oral histories are held at the University of Washington, and they were captured with a cassette recorder. All right, remember those? So unfortunately, when I was doing research and trying to find out about these oral histories, they hadn't been digitized yet. So they provided me with transcripts, which is great. So I had a few of my friends read some of these transcripts. So first up, we have a transcript from Lauren Larga talking about their experience at Madam Peabody's. Now, one thing to know is that Lauren Larga is a pseudonym, which may indicate that Lauren wasn't comfortable sharing their name. It's talking about these sensitive issues. It's really unclear. But anyway, her words tell a great story. And Lauren Larga's words will be read by Greta Flowers.
The first place I ever went was Mrs. Peabody's Dancing Club. Now that was an experience. That was the first time I had ever seen women cross-dressing. I didn't have real impressions of what to expect. I had read these slick romances where women were upper middle class. Suddenly, I'm pressed into this milieu. Lots of cross-dressing women, lots of violence, all kinds of stuff. And I thought, this isn't me. This is not what I'm in association with. I wasn't indignant or morally outraged. I was just surprised. And I stepped back a little bit. I received severe censure for the fact that I didn't want to be one thing or the other. Even before the feminist movement, I had this perception that I didn't like role-playing gender roles. I didn't want to take on a gender role, and that was a big no-no.
So while Madam Peabody's allowed dancing underground, by the 1960s, clubs like the 611 Tavern and the Golden Horseshoe permitted dancing on street level. Now, the 611 opened in 1965, and it was one of the most popular bars in Pioneer Square. Before the bar moved in, the space was a rundown place. But co-owners John Chadwick and McIver Wells transformed it into a welcoming space with crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. Red and gold drapes covered the windows, which stopped passerby from peeking in, which was a necessary calculation at the time. Mirrors lined the walls, and so a man standing in one place in the bar could see another man standing anywhere else in the bar. That's a nice little trick right there. So most of the patrons of the 611 were men, and they weren't allowed to dance. In order to change this, co-owner McIver Wells needed permission from the cops. He was denied, but McIver was relentless and persisted, and finally the cops agreed to allow same-sex dancing. But only if McIver bought another neighborhood bar as a place where the cops could play cards. So this sounds ridiculous and audacious, because it is. But the cops held the upper hand. For decades, owners of LGBTQ+ establishments, as well as those owned by people of color, often had to pay off cops. The cops said it was to protect the patrons, but in truth, it was straight up bribery. And McIver Wells wasn't happy about it. So in another recorded oral history, McIver Wells described how cops treated customers. McIver's words are read by Michael Magpie Luella.
Well, if you paid off, they didn't enforce those laws very much. Like, you're not supposed to stand and drink. You're not supposed to, be by the bar or walk with a beer. If you were drinking at the bar and you wanted to go sit with friends of yours at the table, the bartender or whoever worked the floor had to carry the beer. But if you paid them off and things like that, they didn't enforce those kind of rules. So paying them off, you did gain a little. But when I quit paying them, and before they found out that I was going after their rear ends, they'd come in, and if a guy or a girl had one cheek on the stool, they'd kick the stool and say, "Put both of them on there." And that's when I got the newspapers after them.
So, to give us a little more insight into this time period in Pioneer Square, I'd like to welcome our first guest, historical geographer Julian Barr. I'm going to sit next to you. Hi, Julian. How are you?
Good. Hi, everyone.
Good. Welcome, welcome. But would you like to introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I'm Julian Barr. I use he, him, his pronouns. I am by training a historical geographer, a PhD candidate at UW, but more my regular work is I work at South Seattle College. I'm a staff there, soon to be a tenure-track faculty at South Seattle College, teaching geography and kind of related fields. I got into this work at Pioneer Square through my dissertation work, but ultimately because I really love public history. I think it's really important to push public history, and especially the histories that are kind of hidden and unacknowledged or sort of put away. And I came to Pioneer Square as I was just really interested in queer history of the city generally. Capitol Hill has its reputation, but obviously there had to have been something before that. So I discovered Pioneer Square a similar way. And really came to, really figure out like its deep history, but also its unacknowledgement publicly. There's the National Park Service has a bit of a walking tour of Pioneer Square, the general history. There's placards all around the neighborhood. only one of them actually acknowledges that there was a gay bar in the square. Its focus is in queer history, but it only focuses on one, and it doesn't actually give you the context. Why was a gay bar here? It doesn't really go into it. So when I was doing my work, I discovered a walking tour that the Northwest Lesbian Gay History Museum Project had created with local geographers, Michael Brown, Larry Knopp, and Angie McCarroll. And that walking tour sort of had went away in the 2000s. Then there wasn't really much documentation around it. So I took that walking tour, and I gave it a little bit of a refresh in 2016. It just kind of lived in people's heads, right? There was nothing there. I created a digital map, but also I started giving the walking tour. And I really loved giving the walking tour around the square. People really enjoyed the actual walking and talking of it. I stopped with COVID. Hopefully we'll bring it back one day. But yeah, that's kind of my connection to the space.
And I want to say that this walking tour that Julian's talking about and that he kind of refreshed was so instrumental in the work I did for HistoryLink. So I want to thank you. And it was really reading this walking tour that made me think, ooh, I need to contact this Julian Barr right here and ask some questions, right? And so one of the things I would love to hear a little bit about is sort of the cops and payoff schemes in that area.
Yeah, I think, everyone, when I've done the actual walking tour around, what I think really gets people is I always get the question, what was the Stonewall? Where are the riots? Where are these stories? And I'm like, well, I don't have this for you. And that's because of a police payoff system.
And you mean a local version of Stonewall
here
in Seattle?
Everyone expects there's a local version. And I don't know why everyone wants the local one. But it's not always the case. That's not always the reality. And that was because of the payoff system. It was a really long system. In reality, if you really had to pinpoint its start date, it was in about 1893. There was not a queer bar called the People's Theater on Washington 2nd. At the time, there was this barmaid's ordinance that essentially you weren't allowed to serve alcohol if you were a woman. So the People's Theater decided, well, we're not gonna hire women to serve. We're just gonna hire them to be the entertainment. And then they ended up just serving the alcohol. But to get around that little legal loophole, they paid off the cops. And why that's the starting point, that's the first time someone does this. And then by the time you start having these bars like the Casino, and all these others that eventually end up paying off, it's that system. It was already very well established that the cops could get away with it. They could simply demand money when they were seeing illegal activity go, and get the money for it. And not just the cops either, it was also the liquor board enforcement was part of that as well. But it was such an established system. I think the 611, the 614 story has always been my favorite story because I think it's the height of sort of the nonsense that how much they could get away with.
You want to tell that one briefly?
Oh yeah.
Sure.
The story you shared, yeah.
What I shared, okay.
Yeah, and even things there was one pretty close by called the Caper Club, who established itself as they were trying to be a high-end bar. The cops noticed that, and their payoff was almost $600 a month, which is thousands of dollars a month. And that's part of the system. There was no consistency. It was kind of nonsensical. Cops could kind of go and ask for more at any time. Nothing going on that made any sense. So it's unpredictable. But also, I think it showed partially, I think the resilience of the some of these bars. Some of them did survive. I would say some of that, they are majority, white male-owned bars. And I think that was a big part of that. They had the ability to have the financial resources to do such a thing.
Great point.
But certainly there were some that never could have made it and never were going to make it. You see some common owners that own more than one bar. That helps a lot. But also, it only stopped like that they weren't going to raid a bar. It didn't stop what was happening outside. It didn't stop their harassment of people, of all people, but in particular people of color and women, especially women that were not to gender norms. Cops were always around because of the payoff system, so they enjoyed harassing people right outside the bars or going to the bars or on the streets around them. So it didn't stop any of that, but it certainly made the spaces, for lack of a better word, slightly more safe. But that's a hard one to say, right?
Yeah. So another thing that people were dealing with was anti-sodomy laws. And when you did your tour, you started somewhere specific. So can you talk about why tell us where it was and why you wanted to start there, your tour?
Yeah, so I started my tour on Washington 2nd, where the casino and Doubleheader are, two icons of queer Pioneer Square. But also on that corner, about 40 years before the casino even opens, two men, John Collins and Ben Layton. John Collins is a sailor. He's about 18 years old. Ben Layton is a teenager, a local here in Seattle. It's 1895. They meet each other on this corner. They meet each other to hook up. The sailor had a room nearby called the Canal. They go there. They go into a room together. There was some sex work happening at the Canal, and one worker noticed that two men went into this room together. She spied on them through the little window that you would see like on top of a door. And, and she caught them and, opened the door. The teenager tried to run. She and someone else actually grabbed him and called the police. All of this, of course, was under a brand new sodomy law that was in 1893. The cops arrested, but particularly focused on the sailor John because he was older. So they kind of portrayed him as like an aggressor. He claimed nothing happened. He was literally just sleeping the whole time. Obviously, it was a lie. But that was his story. Because of that dynamic of aggressor and sort of victim, the teenager, Ben, really freaked out after some questioning and actually skipped town. Once he skipped town, they really had no case. So the case was dropped. But I start there because it's the first arrest that we know of that we assume is correct. We don't have any evidence there was another one before this. But for me, as a historical geographer, I start there because while it's not the most positive story, it's like that. It's a moment of time where people are being othered, and that's what we really look for. Is like, what's the moment that people are being told they are not supposed to be, they're not quote unquote normal, and then they start regulating that. This way, legally, at the exact same time, we also saw the medical community creating a diagnosis that homosexuality was a disease, it was a mental illness. That's the moment where that othering happens, and then eventually why you need spaces like the casino and why you need Pioneer Square as a whole for the community, because that's the legal reality people are living in, and that's when they're going to go after you, is when this is true.
Fabulous. Now, Julian, we're going to call you back up in a bit. How about that? All right, but thank you for being here, and thank you for sharing that. That was dynamite. Thank you for that context. Okay, so now we learned a little bit about why the casino, the Silver Slipper, the 611, why they were so important. Well, actually, I just mentioned a place, the Silver Slipper, but we haven't said that yet. But we're about to talk about the Silver Slipper now. So the 611 was a place where mostly men went. But during that time, women gathered in lesbian bars, including the Silver Slipper. And so when women visited some lesbian bars in the post-World War II era, they sometimes carried a butch outfit and a purse. And so they would walk into a space with this butch outfit and a purse, and then they'd go in the restroom, and then they'd change into their butch wear and then come out all butched up. But at the Silver Slipper, lesbians could bring their whole selves, which sometimes led to some conflict inside the space. Because there, women who enjoyed living a butch femme lifestyle sometimes bumped up against women who practiced the lesbian feminism of the 60s and 70s, which partly sought to distance lesbian sexuality from masculine roles and patriarchal views. Now, one person who visited the Silver Slipper was Jan Denali. And in this audio clip of her oral history, Jan talks about music and gender. And Jan's words are read by Greta Flowers.
The early 70s was an exciting time for lesbian women, lesbian progressive culture. There was so much going on. And I was way into music and started playing again. I'm a fiddler. So I was going a lot of old-timey stuff, but I also did some jazz and rock and roll. In the 70s, Lesbi Friends was my string band. Now we're playing under the name Hot Flash. We played at the Silver Slipper. That was fun. We were glad it was there and everything, but it was really dark and dreary upstairs. What was happening then? You know, this was the mid-70s, is the coming together of real old-style lesbianism and new-style lesbianism. That's how I experienced it there, the old style, pre-Stonewall kind of stuff, and certainly pre-second wave feminism, which was when I came in riding on that glorious wave. I don't know what they would say, because you see these movies where women from that period are talking and it's not all dark, dreary, but we came in having benefited from their lives and getting to be less oppressed than they were. We came in with an expectation of outness and joyousness and I'm in your face and I don't care kind of deal, which was not possible in the era before us. So the Silver Slipper was definitely the old style.
I'm in your faceness. Ah, yes, this sort of becomes a theme as we continue on. So there was the 611. There's the Silver Slipper. They all had their own cachet, their own little bit of flair. But little in the city could compare to Seattle's first disco. Shelley's Leg, hey, yes, right? Which opened in 1973. 1973, that is 50 years ago, the first disco opened in Seattle, all right? And sadly, though, this disco opened or grew out of a tragedy. So now I'm going to tell you the story. The story has a lot of parts. The story, every time I hear this story and I've read about the story, it doesn't seem real to me that this happened. But this is basically what I've been able to figure out and what people have told me. So In 1970, there was a French restaurant in Pioneer Square, and they decided to have a parade to celebrate Bastille Day, the National Day of France. So first, the restaurateurs held a dinner party on top of the sinking ship parking garage. Y'all know this place, right? Yeah, so imagine having a dinner party on top of a garage. Sounds really sweet, doesn't it? So they have this dinner party on the garage, and then they were going to have a parade. So it was a small parade, nothing too fancy, right? It had 2 cars and a pickup truck hauling a Dixieland band, which of course we all know is deeply connected to France, Dixieland bands. So to add a little like zhuzh to the parade, the restaurant owners asked a local person to include his antique fire truck. And so the fire truck owner said sure, but without speaking to the restaurant owners, he decided to add a cannon that shot confetti. So the parade sets off. You know, it's a parade, right? It's Bastille Day. It's a beautiful warm day. I think it was like 85 degrees or something that day. Warm, sunny day in Seattle. And so people are downtown and they see this parade and people get excited. And so like a crowd forms. And in this crowd was a 22-year-old named Shelley Bowman. And Shelley had moved here from Florida. And so people loved this parade, but what people really loved was this cannon. And, you know, people, whenever the parade would stop, sometimes the people would climb up on top of the cannon, right? And they invited Shelley to climb up, and Shelley climbed up on top of the cannon as well, but didn't feel so comfortable, so got back down on the safe ground, where she thought she would be the best place for her to be. So the parade continues winding through the streets. More and more people, more celebration. People are drinking. Hey, it's Bastille Day. People decide to light fireworks because, hey, it's Bastille Day. And at some point, people climbing on top this cannon, no one actually knows what happens, but this cannon had this confetti inside of it. And somehow the confetti got wadded into a ball. And somehow this cannon, which was pointed up at the sky, started to go down and point toward the ground and the crowd. So people start to notice this. There's a little sense of panic about it. People are trying to keep everyone calm, but somehow the cannon ignited. And this wad of confetti, which was supposed to come out as little pieces of paper, was basically like a paper cannonball. It shot out and it hit Shelley Bowman in the abdomen. She was knocked down onto Occidental Street. So she lay there sprawled. She was in grave condition. Luckily, there was a doctor in the crowd who sort of helped her to make sure she kept pressure on the wound. They had an ambulance show up. She was taken to Harborview Medical Center. She was close to death. The only way they could save her life was to operate, and they amputated one of Shelley's legs. So she was left in a wheelchair for the rest of her life. And she recovered. Her recovery was like 6 months long. It was really pretty tragic. So after she got out of the hospital, Shelley sued. She sued the city because she said the cops were not protecting people when there was a live weapon around. She sued the restaurant owners for having the parade, and she sued the guy with the cannon. At an out-of-court settlement, Shelley won $330,000. Now, that's a lot of cash in like 1970s, right? So Shelley has this money, and one of Shelley's friends, so I guess another part of the story is that Shelley, when she moved from Florida, she wound up befriending gay men. And so there were these gay men who were living in this house. They had a lot of spaces. People were living in rooms. And Shelley wound up like going to a party and hanging out and spending the night. And then she wound up living with them in their basement in one of the rooms. And so she heard all kinds of stories. And some men there had this idea. They had gone to San Francisco to a disco. And they wanted to have a disco in Seattle. So they had this dream, and Shelley had money. So Shelley gave them money, 2 friends, to open a disco. And in honor of her, they called the disco Shelley's Leg. I mean, really?
All of the old drugged out hippies all got jobs, and we went down there and we worked our little asses off. I don't even remember the year we opened it up. It was 73 maybe, 72, around there sometime. And from the day it opened up, it went absolutely apeshit. Seattle had never had a disc jockey. All you had was records on the jukebox. The bar was decorated. I have never seen a bar as pretty as Shelley's leg was. You'd walk into the door, and there was a long, long hallway from here to maybe the building across the way. And then you walked into the bar, up the stairs. Right here was a balcony, and then a pool table, and then another little sidebar. You'd go out to your left, and there was a whole bar there. Just inside the side door was a hat check stand. There was the dance floor, and then in this corner was the disc jockey booth. He was looking down at everything. It was multicolored plexiglass and lights. It was, Jesus Christ, it was a drag queen's delight. It was unbelievable, unbelievable. And of course, all the old brick. It was a beautiful, beautiful bar.
It was a drag queen's delight. Where is RuPaul, honey? Hello, so there it is, a drag queen's delight, Shelley's leg. Here's a sign that hung in the bar. So imagine 1972, 73, there's a sign like this in a disco in Seattle, right? That is a bold statement to make in a space. And here's how it looked inside. Here's where the sign was inside that beautiful, beautiful bar. So again, those were the words of Joe McGonigal, and they were read by Michael Magpie Luella. So, community, bars, taverns, disco, but there were also other places that LGBTQ folks found community. And sometimes they found it in bathhouses, at least gay men did. And one of the earliest bathhouses in Pioneer Square was called South End Steam Baths. Now look, I don't know if you all can see this, so I hope I can point it out to you. Like, see the little sign right there? There it is, right there. Now, I thought it'd be great to hear a little bit about community, other forms of community, and someone who may know a little bit about South End Steam Baths. So here comes our next guest, Tony Radovich. You sit right here, dear, right there.
Is this on?
It's on, baby. You're live. It's hot, as they say in the industry. The mic is hot. Yes. So, hi, Tony. How are you?
Hi, Rosette. Thank you for having me today. Hello, everybody.
Would you like to introduce yourself? Say something about yourself?
My name is Tony Radovich. I'm a third-generation Seattleite. My parents grew up in Ballard, both on the same street, by the way. I grew up in Tacoma. Thank you. But I was coming up to Seattle as a young homosexual at the age of 15. My adult life now is that I'm involved with updating our antiquated behavioral health system here in the state of Washington. And
yes,
so,
honey, thank you.
Yeah. So that's what I do as an adult life. My other interests are local history. I really find it kind of interesting and important because if I know history, I know self. If I have no history, I have no self. So I try to say that to people about the importance of our history, local or other places. And I think it helps tell a story about inclusion and all of those things that build community and the importance of communities.
Fabulous. So there you were, a young person. I mean, how did you even find out about, or I shouldn't put it that way. What did you think about Seattle when you started coming here as a young person?
Well, I met somebody in my neighborhood who was a couple of years older than me, and we realized that we were both queer, and he said, hey, we should go to Seattle, but I can get my parents' car, but we're going to have to siphon gas from other cars so that we can make the trip to Seattle. So yeah, that's, I know. But I think it's the importance of, as a queer kid, I needed to find other people just like me. And I think it was a desire for community and that sense of belonging, because growing up in an oppressive home, I searched that out. Yeah, so downtown Tacoma, but I really had a deep sense of connection to Seattle. Yeah.
What did you discover when you got here?
Oh, it was beautiful. You know, I talk about how that time in my life, 1975 to 79, and as I got older, because few things brought me comfort in that time. A yellow transistor radio, Paul Lind, Joanne Worley,
Yes.
Donna Summer, and the streets of Seattle. And I found community. I found other queers, young people, my queer aunties, lesbians, misfits, dykes. It was all there, and it really was a kaleidoscope of people and community, and it was beautiful. It really was beautiful.
Now, we've spoken about this before, and one place you mentioned was somewhere called Penny's Corner. Can
Yes.
you tell us about Penny's Corner?
Yes. Penny's Corner was on the corner of 2nd and Pike. And, oh, you have a picture of it there. Oh, that's great. Well, that's where Target is now. But on 2nd Avenue, where Penny's Corner was going south, where all the male hustlers hung out. And it was wonderful. It was beautiful. I think I really want to emphasize the importance of how community unfolded for me during that time. And I say that because it really was based on survival and looking out for one another. So when I talk about sex work, I really want to emphasize that we really did look out for one another, and we everything from telling people, oh, this is where I'm going, and then they would get the license plate number of the car, right? So if we got into it, then we had this expectation that we had to check in with somebody who was usually a friend or somebody that we knew, and we all had our sort of groups of people, and we looked out for each other and checked in with each other when we came back. So it really was a sense of belonging within that atmosphere, right? And it really was based on survival, and just like it is now. I really need to reinforce that, because as queer young people coming from oppressive homes and being kicked out, we have to turn to basic survival. And sex work is often one of those things. Like, I couldn't have a job because I wasn't 18 yet, so, you know, and I wanted my spending money because I wanted to go do stuff. I was an adventurous teenager. How about if I just...
All right, so some of your adventures took you to the South End steam baths.
Yes, well, South End steam baths was a respite or a refuge for us. me and a couple friends of mine who we traveled from Tacoma, that was one of the only places where they really didn't check ID. We had a couple of the employees who would let us in, only because we got to know them and they knew what we were doing and gave us a safe place for us to rest or sleep so that we could go home the next day. And it really was, it was beautiful in the sense that elders were looking out for younger people, right? And it was the importance of how that sense of community and looking out for one another was a really important part of coming into that full sense of self.
One thing I found was a floor plan from the South End steam baths. So I don't know if can you see it? Is it all right for you to turn around right there?
It looks very familiar, yes.
So one thing to say is you can see here, it says you enter on the sidewalk, right? Here's First Avenue.
Yes.
Here you enter on the sidewalk, and you
And
can
you
walk
go down the stairs, and you went into the basement, and there were the second arrow, which you had your kind of little laser pointer on. Right to the right of that was the check-in, where it had the glass door, and the person would take your money, and then they'd buzz you in. Yeah, it was exactly. I already knew, and my favorite room was number 8. Like, I would always hope that somebody wasn't in 8 because it was close to the pool, it was over by the showers, and it really was like away from everything else where it was kind of quiet. Right? But yeah, it was great. The pool was kind of gross. I think I only went in there a couple of times, but it was, the smell of chlorine was something that I will never forget.
Now, for this podcast, we went to the place together. It's not there now. But we went to the place where it was. And I wonder, what was it like for you then, or what is it like now to go to that area where the steam baths used to be?
Well, much how you were talking about the importance of destinations, and I think your former speaker talked about what I refer to as anchors in community, right? Because I think as we move forward and gentrification happens, we're losing our anchors as queer community, right? And so my experience of going through that, because it really was, or it had been over 30 years, even longer actually, but it all came flooding back, so to speak. And I think that it was an important, definitive moment in my life, right? Where I was proud of who I was, and I'm so glad that I had that experience because it was all a positive experience for me. It wasn't nothing negative. I think the only negative thing that was happening at the same time was that, so all the male hustlers were on Second, and on First Avenue were all the women. And that was the time where the Green River Killer was happening. So there was all this uncertainty and happening at the same time. And so we were all talking to each other, the men, the boys, and the women and the girls. Like, we were really talking about like being careful and, you know, all of those pipelines or conduits of information. And so, but yeah, I do not regret any part of that. It helped form who I am today.
Well, it formed someone beautiful. So thank you, Tony. Thank you. We're going to come back at the end, all right? Thank you so much, dear. So, community and the bathhouse. And there were other places people sought out community, including the city's first gay community center. Now, the gay community center wasn't actually very far from South End Steam Baths, and it opened in 1971 in the basement on Cherry Street. And it was started by 3 local activists, Paul Barwick, Robert Perry, and Fagala Ben Miriam. And they wanted a coffee house vibe, you know, complete with a dance floor, but they were broke, so they had to improvise. So they fashioned tables from found tabletops that were mounted onto tires from a junkyard. And one of the founders described the place as tacky, tacky, tacky. But it was also popular. And by the end of its first year, more than 2,000 people had traipsed down the stairs into that basement. And it benefited from more than 4,000 volunteer hours. 4,000, right? In 1971 and 72. Imagine all those LGBTQ plus people being like, this is important, we want to help out, we're going to give our time. But the success could not counter its economic woes. So when the landlord wanted to raise the monthly rent from $175 to $375 a month, organizers had to close the space. And so the Pioneer Square home of the Gay Community Center came to an end in 1972. A couple years later, in 1974, the center opened on Capitol Hill, where it remained until 1977. So here are all these things that are bringing people together around community. And sadly, another way that people were brought together in this neighborhood was by crisis, in particular HIV/AIDS. So I want to say that I'm just going to talk about this for a minute, but you could do a whole weekend about the effects of HIV/AIDS on Seattle and people living here. So I just want to make that clear that this is just, I'm going to talk about it briefly, but this is not anything close to what the experience really was. So the Northwest AIDS Foundation began in 1982 or 83. Reports of the time that it started differ, but it didn't open an office until 1986 when it opened an office in Pioneer Square. Now, the Northwest AIDS Foundation raised money to support people living with HIV/AIDS, and it helped folks with all manner of problems, including untangling thorny issues like how to receive disability payments. And it created the city's first safe sex campaign called Rules of the Road. But these were hard times. Not only were people's friends, lovers, family members, neighbors sick and dying, there was rampant homophobia and AIDS hysteria. In the first year the office was open in Pioneer Square, a Seattle plumbing company refused to send plumbers to unclog the foundation's sink because they feared that the plumber might get HIV from showing up. Now, when the foundation's then president, Rob Rohan, heard that, he said, what do they think they were going to do? Like have sex with the sink? So, but still, there was hysteria at the time. So the Northwest AIDS Foundation continued to help people through the 80s, but as more services and people migrated to Capitol Hill, the foundation followed. And it relocated to the Hill in the 1990s, finding a new home on Broadway. So the foundation's original home underscored how LGBTQ plus activism began in Pioneer Square. And the neighborhood was also home to the city's first Pride. So let's have a little historical context here. In 1969, all the way across the country in good old NYC, police raided the Stonewall Inn, a bar frequented by LGBTQ plus people. People were dragged out. The police struck a lesbian who was being pulled into a paddy wagon. It was terrible. It was chaos. It must have been a complete nightmare. But people fought back, and they protested for days with trans folks and people of color in visible roles. So, fast forward 5 years, 1974. And folks in Seattle wanted to mark the 5-year anniversary of Stonewall by having a pride picnic in Occidental Square. Here's a little poster they put together. Here's my favorite part of this poster. Right here, they were going to have a street dance, but they forgot the R. So they had to put the R there for the arrow. Oh my gosh, I love that about this poster so much. All right, so they had a pride picnic, 1974. About 200 people showed up. There were banners there that proclaimed, "Proud to be lesbian, proud to be gay." People ate bread and cakes because it was a picnic, after all, and pedestrians took photos, as did one police officer. So that made people a little nervous, but thankfully there were no reports of harassment. Here they are gathering there for that 1974 Pride. And while the picnic served people who wanted to enjoy the sunshine, the late night crowd got their own gift as well, because at 9 p.m. there was a street dance. That was the street, right? S-T-E, oop, forgot the R, put that R in there, dance. So 3 years later, in 1977, then Mayor Wes Ullman proclaimed June 25th through July 1st the city's first officially sanctioned Gay Pride Week. The parade began on June 25th at Occidental Park. And it traveled north on First Avenue to Pike Place Market. Then it hung a right and then went to Westlake Mall. And all some 2,000 people participated in that Pride. Well, we got Pride coming up, right? It's just a week away. And seeing these people all joyous just makes me happy. And one of the great things about working on this project, this walking tour, is how happy I have been to talk to people, to hear people's stories. And I got to meet so many great people. I mean, my life has been touched by them. And so I want to bring up another one of those people that I met who is going to be our last guest. And so I would like to introduce Gil Gordon. Come on up, Gil. Where you go, dear? You can have the seat. Yes, that mic is all you. All you.
It works.
It works, honey. We've been practicing. We had to get ready for you. How are you doing today, Gil?
Nervous.
You're nervous?
Yes.
Why are you nervous, honey?
Well, I can't talk and speak as eloquent as you folks have. That's not my thing. My thing is dancing.
Okay, wait a minute. Now listen. You just put the microphone a little bit closer to you, right? Because what did you say your thing was?
Dancing.
Dancing. All right. So I want you to tell me a little bit about your history of dancing.
Well, let me go back a little.
Go back, honey. Go back.
I did 8 years in the United States Air Force before I came to Seattle. And coming up, I was always in church. That was from my mom. So I have that religious foundation from many, many years. And so when I went into the Air Force, every base I went to, I joined the Protestant choir. And so it was really interesting. When I went to Guam in '69, the organist and her husband sort of adopted me. And I went over there every Sunday for dinner. And then one Sunday she asked me, "What are the things you like?" And I says, "Well, I love dancing, I love clothes, I love food." And she says, "Well, you ever thought of making clothes?" And I said, "Oh, no, 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 no. My mother and sister both sewed growing up, but that was not a thing to do as a young boy, and really a black boy. Just don't do those things." So when I get into the Air Force, she says, "Well, let me start you on something simple." And that was a dashiki shirt. like an African type shirt. Anyway, I fell in love with sewing. It was just awesome for me. And so after 8 years in the Air Force, I was made rank, and it was really good. It was good money, but I was starting to feel like coming out, and you don't come out in the Air Force during that time. And so I said, it's time for you to leave. And so before that, a friend says, there's going to be some dancing on Halloween night at a special bar. Would you like to come? And I said, sure, that'd be great. So I went to this bar. Police came in. The only identification I had was my Air Force card. And they looked at it, they said, and then nothing happened. And now I was getting out of the Air Force in January of 70. And so they brought me in. They said, why were you in this gay bar? And I says, gay bar? It was Halloween night. Thank you, Jesus. Halloween night. Everyone was dancing with everyone. And that was the only thing that I was able to get out of that situation. And I says, this is a sign, Gil Gordon, get your ass out of this place. So I got out on an honorable discharge, all the benefits you can have. And so I talked to a friend here in Seattle, because I didn't want to go back to Pittsburgh where I live, relatives and all that. And so he says, well, why don't you come to Seattle? They have a 3-year course in men's custom tailoring that you can take, and the Air Force will pay for it. And so I said, well, that sounds great. So that's what brought me to Seattle. And so, and it was interesting, when I came here, I had part-time jobs because I was going to school full-time at Seattle Community College. And I was doing phone soliciting. I worked at a Jell-O factory, and it was awful. So my friend says, well, there is a bar downtown. Do I go into that?
Go into it.
Okay. There was a bar down Pioneer Square, Occidental and Yesler, called the Dollhouse. They had go-go boys there. And so my friend says, Gil, if you go down there, you can outdo any of those so-called go-go boys. And so I said, I love dancing. And so I said, well, let me go try. So I went down there, and there was this very, and please excuse my language, butch dyke owner named Jerry. And so she says, well, can you dance a couple dances for me? And I says, sure. So she said, can you take off your shirt? I says, sure. And so it was really interesting because she put on this really hot disco song. And so I just got up on the dance, doing my thing, whatever. She says, well, when can you start? I says, really? And I said, well, probably the weekend because I go to schools during the week. And she says, well, you sure you can't start tomorrow? It was wonderful. It was just wonderful. So anyway, that's how I got my start in a gay bar in Pioneer Square. What are you going to do?
I'm going to show a picture.
I just happened to bring some pictures.
Do you happen to bring some? First, I'm going to show a painting.
Oh.
Can I show that first?
Sure.
And I've been
Let me tell you a little bit. When I was dancing, I made that outfit. The little as it was. When I was dancing, people will come and hit on you or whatever. Anyway, this gal came up to me, and she says, I'm going to University of Washington in art, and I'm going to do a painting, and then I'm going to turn in slides for the course. And she says, I'm going to let you have the oil painting, and I'll take the slides. And so she came over and took about 20 pictures of me. Back then it was just, you know, the little camera. And she says, I'm going to let you have the oil painting. And she brought this, and I nearly died. It's like 14 feet.
It's pretty big, Gil.
It's huge.
It's huge. It's a huge painting.
I couldn't believe it, you know. And she said, it's yours free. And then I have, will you want the others?
Yes, I'm going to go get them.
Okay.
Okay. Be right back. So do you want, well, here, I'll bring these up.
Oh. During that time, 71, 2, and 3, at that time, the community had different awards that they would give trophies for, like Best Drag Queen of the Year, Best Dancer of the Year. And in 1972, I got Best Dancer of the Year in the gay community. And then...
Yeah, that's a round of applause.
And then I worked in the dollhouse 71, 2, and 3. And then I had to quit because I graduated from school and I started working at Frederick and Nelson's apartment store downtown. And so the dollhouse gave me a trophy that says Best Dancer, not only for 1, not only for 2, but 1901 through 3. Best dancer. And I, you know, it's just, when I look back at those days, it was just phenomenal. It was just awesome times for me.
Well, when you talk about looking, I've got something else for us to look at.
Should I take off my shirt?
That's your call, dear. Okay, Gil has these photos. I'm gonna like kind of walk them around so folks can see them. Do you want to tell us about these pictures?
A friend, while I was dancing, said I should have some type of record of the situation. And so he took these pictures of me as I was dancing.
Now, there's also someone in the center picture.
Now, I thought you might not notice that. Back then, we used to have things or people called lovers. Well, that was my first lover here in Seattle.
What was his name?
Bill Dubé.
Anything you want to tell us about Bill?
No.
That's your right, David. That's totally your right. So, you know, I was talking about meeting people, and you know, I wound up meeting Gil because I was talking to someone about the earliest Pride events in Occidental Park, and the person said, "Oh, do you know Gil Gordon?" And I was like, "I don't know Gil Gordon." And they're like, "You should contact Gil Gordon." So I got in touch with Gil Gordon, and I went over there with the filmmaker, and I think the filmmaker was a little bit like, "Oh my gosh, what have we just walked into?" Right? Because you just opened your home to us, and we were there for about an hour plus, and we were just talking and having a great time. And I mean, but also when we walked in, like Gil had the whole place set up. Like he had the awards out, he had the painting out, he had these photos out. Like Gil was ready to share.
I must say,
Yeah.
I didn't do that just for you.
Oh, you
24/7. That's
Stand corrected. I stand corrected. Thank you, dear. Thank you. So it was really fantastic, and I wanted to make sure that, you know, I haven't met many award-winning go-go dancers, so, you know, when I have an opportunity to let that person be seen in the world, I want to make sure that happens. All right, so...
One other thing.
Please.
I don't know how I miss not talking about this, but oops, here you go. I helped start the first gay church here in Seattle in 1971. And I've been there for 50 years. I'm the only one they have that's been there since day one. It's called Metropolitan Community Church.
So right now, here it is, LGBTQ plus history. So we've got a few moments, so I'd like to welcome Julian back and Tony back and see if folks here have any questions in the audience, and we can spend a few minutes just having a little chit-chat. If you don't mind, I'm gonna put your photos over here.
No.
I mean, for fun, even at home?
Well,
Hold up the microphone.
Every now and then, well, what was it? It used to be a bar down here in Pioneer Square that I used to go on Sunday nights. The Cuff. They used to, and I used to go there. But as I gotten older, I just sort of stay home mostly. I could. You have a record machine or something? Oh, can I talk to you later? Sorry.
There's no need to apologize. All right, anyone else? I mean, I have lots of questions, of course, but I don't know if anyone else has a question you'd like to ask. Sure, so the question was, there's so many references to different parts of the history, and was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the trans history of Pioneer Square. I don't know if you might be able to say something first, if you want to say something, or if something you could add. I have a comment to make after.
Yeah, I think it's complicated when you look at like the history and what's left over. I use the same oral histories for my work, and when those were collected, it was like really early 2000s. There was quite a few that identified as trans when they did the oral history in 2000s, but they didn't necessarily at the time they were visiting the bars. And I think that's a really important thing to think about, is that for a lot of folks, they didn't, they just didn't have the language, or they were still figuring themselves out. And so like I do a lot of focus on lesbian and queer women, and a lot of that too is about, for them was about gender, and about, wanting to be more feminine or more butch. In particular, it's those, butch women that eventually sometimes came out as trans men later on in life, but that realization came much later in life for so many of them in their oral histories. And that's a pretty common thing you find. So I always tell people that 100% some of these folks are trans people, like for sure. The language though wasn't there at the time as much. It was even, it was exceptionally hard to come out, and the resources were pretty limited until a little bit later on, and a lot of that was also centered around, you found some of that work around, gender affirming care in Capitol Hill and in the U District as well later on. But so yeah, I always acknowledge it, but it's hard because you're just not seeing the identity there. But I think the good assumption can be made. Trans folks were absolutely there and were in the spaces and made their own spaces as well.
Yes, and what I saw, what I read and heard, there was sort of the inference that it was there, but it wasn't people, you're right, it wasn't the language that people used. Like, for example, when learning about Shelley's Leg, Shelley's Leg was a very popular disco, so it was packed. All kinds of people went, and famous people showed up. And one famous person who showed up was Sylvester, the singer, right? So there I was like thinking, oh, Sylvester. Now, when I was a kid and I first saw Sylvester, I saw this person who was identified as, or was spoken of as being a man who would have on like these sequin tube tops, right? These flowing capes and these fabulous little like hats on and everything. Like Sylvester worked. And though when I was trying to figure out how to write about Sylvester at Shelley's Leg, I was like, Sylvester is, well, I don't know what Sylvester is. I don't know how Sylvester identifies. And I'm sure at the time, Sylvester probably wouldn't have used a word like trans because we didn't use terminology like that at the time. I never heard a word like that when I was a kid. So, you know, I was like, well, I guess gender fluid, I guess, is maybe how Sylvester would identify. And so that's a great question. I'm sure that there are people who we would consider to be trans, but I don't know if they identify themselves as trans. And so it makes it sort of difficult to say that there were all these trans people there, though I believe they were there.
There's also a great book that's out of print, but it's Don Paulson did a collection of oral history around female impersonators. And I know from reading that book and how the language didn't per se comment about trans, but there were individuals who identified within that sort of non-binary feeling or sense of. And it's a great book, by the way. And it really touches upon the importance of how female impersonators really captured the whole, up and down the whole West Coast, actually, and did a lot of migrating and celebrating who they were as proud individuals. So you might want to check that. I think it's The Garden of Allah, is that what it is?
That's it.
Yeah.
Did you have a question? Here's one of the great things. I mean, it's a great thing about history, but it's also a great thing I've found about LGBTQ plus history generally anywhere. Like you start talking to a queer person about something, they're like, oh, I remember when I went to that bar, or my boyfriend had this experience, or when I grew up here and I moved to this place. And so I think this is a really important part of establishing community with LGBTQ plus people. And it's why I think Pioneer Square is so important. So we're almost out of time, but I want to ask each of you one question and then I want to show everyone some things. So if you had to use one word to describe your time in Pioneer Square when you were going it up, what word would you use?
Only one.
You can have a few more, Gil,
Okay. Well, what I would say is happy and sad. Now, if you want me to go into that.
I want you to go into it, okay. Yeah.
When I say happy and sad, I loved dancing when I was doing it at the Dollhouse. But the sad thing was I would start at like 7 o'clock and go till 2 in the morning. And the time the people came in at 7, I would see them, talk to them. It was wonderful, but they would be there till 2 in the morning, and you can actually see personality changing. And that was the sad part, how, like me, usually 24/7, I'm just crazy. But, and I don't drink, I don't smoke, not because I think it's bad, it's because I don't need it. I'm just out all the time. So anyway, but it was sad to see people go through the changes that they went through.
Thank you. All right, Tony, what word or words would you use to describe your time in Pioneer Square as a teenager?
Well, I think from so much around what this afternoon has captured for me is the resilience within community and what we need to do to take care of one another as a response associated with some of the things that societal or the systems in which oppress individuals or segments of community, which referred to as the othering. I think that we have our own way in regards to creating those spaces, and I think for me that's something to celebrate, because I think it is a part of who I am. So yeah.
Thank you. All right, Julian, you may not have had direct experience there, but you studied a lot. And so what word or words would you use to describe what you've learned about this LGBTQ plus history of Pioneer Square?
I think one way I describe it is it's a place of like care and community. I mean, ultimately, that's what you find a lot is drag queens caring for younger folks, lesbians caring for each other. And, you know, if it wasn't for these spaces, I think a lot of people would have not been able to live life they wanted to leave. Yeah, if it wasn't for the square.
I love it, a little care in the square. All right. So one thing I thought might be nice would be to show some pictures of what some of these places look like now. So, is it all right for you to turn around? You can just see up there. So here's what the casino Madame Peabody's looks like now. See, it's closed up, still there. The sign's still there. It's locked up, got a gate. I tried to peer over that gate. You can see the little chain right there on the railing leading down and 2 fly strips hanging outside the door. The 611 Tavern. There's not even a 611 address on 2nd Avenue anymore. So I took a number of pictures, and I know that this space with the black awning is 607, and 2 doors down is 615. So the 611 was somewhere in there. The Silver Slipper. Silver Slipper is now gone. It's a tattoo shop, tattoo place on Jackson. When I went there to figure out if it was a Silver Slipper, I asked people who worked there, and they were like, I don't know. No one knew. And finally, one person said, oh, I think there was some sort of lesbian bar here. But you know, Seattle has this history of undergrounds and levels and movement, so I don't think that I think this is the first level, and the second level is no longer there. Brilliant. All right, here's today's Shelley's Leg. It's down, one of the jokes about Shelley's Leg was it was at the foot of South Main Street. The South End Steam Baths. Here it's right behind it, you see the stairs going down in the middle. Right behind it is a rug store selling rugs for lease. The Gay Community Center is now a place for underground tours beneath the streets. By the way, someone who works at the Beneath the Streets now helps lead LGBTQ plus tours of Pioneer Square. And here was the inside here. It was also the Skid Row Theater, and they had done a performance of Annie, Get Your Gun. The Dollhouse, that's where the Dollhouse was, Gil. Right around there, Yesler and Occidental.
Thank you so much and have a lovely day.